community, because I know, having had a career about 15 years, that leads to the soul coming out in the paintings, in the drawings, in the portraits. And so the second artist that I found inspiration with this idea of aesthetic idealism is a current artist called Kehinde Wiley, and he's very well known now for the Barack Obama portrait, the presidential portrait that's on tour. If you ever see, if it's coming through the city, go see it. He's a phenomenal painter. And I actually had this great encounter with Wiley's work. Is that in 2010 I had been a community organizer for a couple of years, and I've been in the living rooms of mothers who lost their sons to violence, heard those stories of the young men, read hundreds of papers, newspaper articles about the lives of those young men. And then I went to attend hundreds of funerals of those same young men who were lost to the street. And when I came to this magazine that was in the bookstore, I saw Wiley, and it was this colorful, expressive, gorgeous paintings of these young Black men in current fashion, posed very much like they were taking out of a Rubens era, right? Baroque era. It didn't seem like they were of today, right? But they were of today, and so that always that was even before I started drawing or doing any art, and I just was absolutely left awestruck. I thought, here I am dealing with this reality of these kids dying, and the only way those things are portrayed is through mass media, and it's a very short paragraph of such and such, age 29, died at the corner of such and such. He has 8 priors, da 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 da, and that's it. That's his entire life in black and white, and maybe a mugshot. And there's no dignity in that. There is no beauty. There's no soul in that. And so when you see Wiley dealing with those same type of men, you can't help but feel like you're in the midst of something significant, of something otherworldly and beautiful. And so his process is extremely interesting. Obviously, his final product is absolutely gorgeous, but I found his process to be even more interesting, and it's come at the sort of a big part of this idea of aesthetic idealism. Is that what he does is he starts out. He actually started out in New York, and he goes outside of his studio. He looks around on the streets of Brooklyn, and he starts eyeing the crowd and sees someone who has a little swagger, a young man who has swagger, right? He's dressed in something that's flashy. He has a certain swagger about him. And he actually goes up and approaches those young men, and he tries to persuade them to come to his art studio upstairs. And so it takes some convincing in this odd scenario, and he brings them up to the studio, and what he has is all these art books laid out on the table. And he said, okay, you look at these paintings, and all the paintings are from like 16th, 17th, 18th century, guys like Rubens, of kings and queens and aristocracy. And he says, go choose something that you feel speaks to your character, right? Speaks to you. And so this young man is just pulled off the street, and all of a sudden he's encountering all of, art history. And maybe he's never been to a museum. Maybe he's never looked at fine art in that way. And I can only imagine how odd that whole process could be. It's otherworldly. And so, as he investigates, he's thinking about himself in the place of these men, these European, wealthy aristocrats, power players in world history. And when he finally selects one, he selects one that he feels is his personal expression, his expression of himself, even now, 400 or 500 years later. As a man in the 21st century. And what happens is Wiley takes that pose and he puts the man does a photo shoot where that young man is doing the pose of the painting in the art books. And what you have is something that is very different. It's this completely they're in this new world of royalty. You know, they're in this aristocratic airs. You know, that's what is involved in the final product. And so, you know, a lesser artist would take a picture of this young man, maybe standing against the building, smoking a cigarette, and then paint that up and say, this is him. Well, Wiley takes the experience of an aesthetic experience through looking at the books as sort of education, and then through that education has this final product where you're seeing this young man as you would never think about him, in a different nature. You're seeing a nature is being revealed that you would never have thought if you would have just passed by with certain ideas of who that young man is. And so, you know, what Wiley does is he's crafting content in a deliberate and thoughtful way. He gets to choose those books. He's choosing what books goes out there. As you can tell, he's not putting, you know, modern art out there. He's not even putting African art, right? He's putting old European masters out there, which is very odd. And he's able to, through that, give shape to human powers. And so by subjecting his model to an aesthetic experience, he can reveal the model in a higher realm of existence, like I said, into that world of kings and queens that only oil paint, you know, the only people who did oil paint during that time are the wealthy, and they pay these masters so that they could put oil on canvas in large displays, put them in gold frames, and put them in institutions. And that was, to Wiley, that was propaganda, right? That was a show of power. And that's how kings and queens sort of showed their majesty, was through the arts. And so basically when I think about Wiley, I really try to think about the overall. What is he doing here? I try to dwell on the method that he's doing within art. Okay, it's hard sometimes to separate social issues from artistic issues. Let's just deal with the artistic issue and how he's creating these beautiful paintings. He's taking this mass cultural perception of these young men, and he actually began with just black and white paintings, black and white pictures that he saw. He saw a mug's photo on the ground. He picked it up and he actually painted that mug photo of this young black man. And that's how he started. He started thinking about how the media portrays young black men. And that's very much in line with what I saw over 15 years of studying media and even the community, how they approach depicting these young men who die on the streets. And so he's taking a mass cultural perception and he's interrupting it through aesthetic experience, right? He's allowing this young man to come off the street. He has certain opinions about himself, and those are interrupted by this aesthetic experience. And such that now this young man is thrown into this realm of the ideal, right? Into the realm of the kings and the queens. And so when really I started thinking about, okay, well, this is very interesting. This is very new. Usually painters, like I said, they go take a picture or they take a model, they paint them, maybe they adjust them. They don't go through this whole process of kind of changing the soul of the man, then, you know, putting him back into the photo. It's this odd, you know, rhythm of nature, art, nature, if that makes sense, like a second nature. And so I started thinking about, let's take this aesthetic experience and let's exaggerate it. Okay, what does that mean? What does that look like? Well, if we exaggerate it, it's going to be a series of aesthetic experiences. Okay, well, what if instead of just looking at an art book for 1 hour or 2 hours prior to the modeling, he looks at the next week, right? And then the next week they go to a museum. And then the next week they actually try to copy and paint these models. What if we exaggerate this whole aesthetic experience over a month, a year, you know, until we're really talking about education. We're really talking about an aesthetic education. And so with this idea, what Wiley brought in, you know, I say he's the beginning of what I call the aesthetic idealism. And really at the center of aesthetic idealism which my project is also about, is the question of education. So it's interesting how now art has kind of gone full circle, because now it is about social change in a way, right? Whenever we read those comments in Times-Picayune about the shootings, everyone says it starts with education. It starts with education, right? We hear that over and over again. My question is, okay, what does that education look like? What is the education that you're talking about? Is it just training? Are we trying to spur, change in his life? What does that look like? So really, now that art is about education through this aesthetic idealism, we have to ask ourselves, what is the ideal education such that we can bring that model, that youth, that young Black man to the heights of beauty with a capital B, right? That's now the role of an artist, is to, create a curriculum, create content such that that young man can reach those heights of beauty and the ideal. And so I've had a very interesting education. Let me change here. I've had a very interesting background in education. When I was 18, I was suspended several times in school, and I was about as close to being expelled as you possibly could get. I was on the verge. Everyone just joked how I was like literally hanging by a thread my senior year. And, I came out of that experience of being expelled and suspended as being humiliated, being just oppressed, feeling like I didn't know who I was, because I didn't think I was the same person who was doing these acts. I didn't think I was the same person who the community thought I was. I knew that there was a nature within me that was different than how people were perceiving me, or even, how I was perceiving myself. And so I had this just sadness about me, this hole within me, trying to find meaning within my life, because everything that I had previously known did not work. I was on the verge of expulsion. I was on the verge of jail. Those things just were not the way to go. And so I was lucky enough to go to St. John's College, which is in Annapolis, Maryland, and it's called the Great Books Program. And the Great Books Program is, in essence, the brand names, the big names of philosophy, literature, poetry, science, and mathematics, and Aristotle, Plato, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, the Bible. We read all of it, all throughout human history, the greatest thoughts ever, thought. And I went into that experience feeling like I didn't know what my life was, right? And I went in diving into this philosophy, diving into this literature and poetry, just trying to find myself, trying to find a reason, trying to find wisdom to elevate myself above this pain, try to find some poetry above that pain. And so I encountered all these men and women throughout the program with that thirst for knowledge, with that thirst for self-knowledge. And one of the people who I came encounter with was Plato, who talks about Socrates, the life of Socrates. And I think it's hard for anyone not to fall in love with Socrates, especially as a young man, because I always imagined when I was reading it, it felt like Seinfeld in a way, like a Seinfeld of philosophy. It was this like crazy drama and comedy, and weird sexual things were going on, and people were drinking, and it was unlike anything you'd read in philosophy, prior, or afterwards, So, and Socrates is just a hoot, he's just hilarious. And so I fell in love with Plato, and one of his key books is The Republic, which is basically his theory of education, right? The entire thing is about the education of the philosopher. And so he's talking about the ideal education, right? Let's forget everything that's out there. Let's construct an education for a philosopher king who will be, the ruler and great poet, philosopher king, for the state. And so, he gives an example of what I see as being the greatest philosophy education. So as we're kind of looking at this, Kehinde Wiley started looking at the aesthetic experiences. That led us to aesthetic education, led us to education, led us to what is the ideal education, and it's leading us now into thinking about Plato's cave. And so I will describe it very briefly because it's one of those images, once you see it, it's hard to get out of your head and you start weighing everything as far as shadows and light. That's all you see. So Plato, constructs this picture of humanity up here. They're chained down, staring at the shadows on the wall of the cave. You can see these guys and they're pointing and they have, all they can see is themselves and the shadows. And they can't see behind them because there's a giant wall. And the wall, behind the wall are these statues that are, these men holding and bringing through. And that's creating the shadows on the wall from this fire in the back, right? Very odd image, right? So the story goes that one day a teacher comes along and compels one of the prisoners over here to look behind him. And so when the prisoner looks behind him, he sees there's a wall. He sees that, look, these are just shadows. There's a fire. It's all a farce. It's all set up, it's all fake. And so what happens is that prisoner then breaks his chains, and he's convinced and persuaded by the teacher to go ascend out of the cave. And when I imagine this, I always imagine all these rocks and it just being a very long, it's not this short, it's a very long rocky road up towards the dim light that you're seeing outside the cave. And he finally gets outside the cave here, and he's blinded by the light. He sees things now as they truly are. He sees the trees as they are. He sees the water, the rocks, all these things that he only saw shadows of. He now saw the reality. He saw the truth. He saw the things in themselves. And so really what he sees and he goes into is the world of ideas, the world of eidos, right? That's what Plato talks about is this is absolute beauty, absolute truth, absolute justice. And so then the prisoner goes back down, having experienced this wild experience of light and truth. And now his existence, he goes back down in the cave. And I've always wondered why that is. And there's a lot of philosophical thought in that. But I think in some way he craves the shadows. He craves being around the other prisoners. He can't be alone. He can't just stare at the abstractions in a way. He craves company. And so he has this odd experience, though, that he is still with the prisoners and he's kind of looking at what they're seeing. He knows it's a farce, but he has to kind of talk about these things and act like they're enjoyable. At the same time, he has the memory or one eye towards this ideal, the ideas, the things as they are. He knows that is our true reality. So he's living this duality of existence. And so really what I think ideal education follows this pattern, right? It starts with the common things. It starts with the individual souls of the young men, of the men in the caves and the shadows. And you work your way up, as the teacher did, kind of persuading, convincing that young man to come out, right? To leave the pitfalls of violence and tyranny and the shadows, chasing the shadows of existence, money, fame, all those experiences that he sees maybe on the corner, and to leave those towards the idea, towards the higher possibilities, towards that higher realm of the spiritual aspects of himself. And so that's what the whole of education kind of is. And so with this sort of idea, I came up with this curriculum as part of the art project, which is the education of eidos. And this basically is my attempt at creating an ideal education for that 12 or 13-year-old that has been arrested, that's gone through all that, and trying to find meaning within his life, trying to let his life see significance in a very real way. And then, like I said, it focuses on reading, writing, discussion, thinking, and creation. And the first thing to do is I'm going to have him do, and I'm going to be doing all these things with him because this is the hardest task he'll do. And he will get paid for this because I believe this is more worthy to pay than if he was just mopping at the end of a night of a shift at McDonald's. This is very hard work. Most men do not want to do this work. Harry will attest that people don't want to do this work. So we'll sit down and we'll write an autobiography so that he thinks about his past, who he was that led up to maybe that arrest, who he is now, and who he wants to be. And what that takes is writing is just thinking. If you can write about it, you're thinking about it, you're imagining, and you're working through things that stay in your mind, and you're allowing them to go outside yourself and make them concrete so you can see them as they are and move on or, grow up from those things. And so through that writing, he's able to contemplate his life, and he's able to set goals, for his future. And through writing, he can start conceptualizing that question: what is the good life? Right? If the past is past, what's the future? What does that look like? And so a lot of this is constructed and thinking, what is that good life? So when we're reading great books, just because they're great doesn't mean the vocabulary is difficult. These are great because they appeal to a 70-year-old scholar, Harvard scholar. Every time they read it, they get something out of it. And every time a 12-year-old, 13-year-old from New Orleans reads something, they get something out of it. It's because these are great ideas. They're made somewhat simplistically, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Bible, even Plato's Cave. There are big concepts to wrestle with. And that's really what reading the great books is about. It's getting into this world where we're grappling with big ideas. Let's get away from the shadows of everyday life. The deadlines, the homework, the little hang-ups. Let's talk about those big things. What is the good? What is justice? What is the soul? What is peace? What is violence? What is love? What is bravery, right? Those are things that in the day-to-day education, youth do not get to think, and most adults don't get to think those big ideas about who they are as a man, as a human being. And so that's what the encounter with the great books is trying to accomplish. The third is dialogue about self-interest. We live in a democracy. We base everything off of dialogue. Through logos, that's dialogue. Through logos is account, reason. That's what the Greek is. And so through accountability, in a way, we find reasons. We find the logic of life. And so for this, we're going to be going out in the community, and the question is, what do you love? Let's go do it today. Let's go meet someone who does something you love. Let's go do an activity if you love something you love. And then we're not just going to do the activity, we're going to contemplate afterwards, okay, what did you like, what did you not like about that? What was good about that? Why did you like that? Give account of your passions. And that's something that the artist's life does very well. We always are talking about the things we love, right? Going on and on, maybe too much. But we do give an account of those things that we have passion for. And once we understand, the things that maybe are of that world of the shadows that he loves, we can start extracting and start bringing up that ladder of love so he can start chasing those activities that are maybe a little more soul enriching. But it starts with doing just naturally what he loves. The fourth is thinking, self-knowledge. Quickly, this is about meditation. I remember when I was a kid, I remember all the times I had to go to timeout. I remember having to spend 15 minutes, and it felt like an eternity in silence. It felt like I literally was on keel over of boredom, of not having something in front of me. Even now I see it with the kids, it's even worse because they're so used to having a phone, like literally in front of their face. It's even harder to have that silence. But in meditation, you allow your mind to wander, and it starts kicking up all those things of the shadow world. And then eventually you start thinking of those bigger things because you're bored, and your soul starts getting invested in the imagination of your mind. And you start thinking about those larger ideas. and you start thinking about, your mind is just looser and goes towards the future, it's malleable. So you can start thinking about maybe the things you were putting off thinking about when you just let your mind wander, in those daily lives. And then the last thing is creating their myth. And this is my favorite. This is the end product of these paintings are going to be a true collaboration. Some artists say that, they have collaborative work, right, with the community, but I want to make sure that is first and foremost within this project, is that this child is allowed to write their narrative about who they are and who they want to be. And I am, as the artist, a facilitator of that vision, of those thoughts, so that the end result is that he sees up there not a picture that was taken by a tourist, in a glimpse, that this is someone who has been with him for over a year, seen his growth, seen his struggle, heard his intimate thoughts, and put it back on the canvas as he saw it, right, in a better form, in a more colorful, philosophic form. And so what that means is that with each photo shoot, we're going to talk about the philosophy of each one. What's the message there? What do you want to say? How do you want to be perceived? What's the story? What do you want to wear? So he's going to be hands-on with me, going through that whole, design of, the props, the symbols. What are you wearing? Let's go buy it. Everything. What's your posture? And these are going to be a constant discussion before we get to the photo shoot, so that he is, like I said, very hands-on, and it's very, very much, a big part of, his life there. So the last part I want to talk about is bringing it all together. And what I really want to say is that I've seen all this stuff happening in the art world. I've seen the artist as community leader, right? The artist as catalyst, the artist as sort of this creator of community. These are sort of the way we're talking about artists, street artists, that go in and use the power of activism in their art. And I wanted to always get deeper. What is that about? What is really going on with that? Such that we don't have to use this language of social sciences to explain it. So what I came up with is sort of a definition of what this movement is, such that I hope that people who are using it, like Kehinde Wiley, like my friend B. Mike, who I see inklings of this stuff going through, can use it and expand so that we know what we're doing. So aesthetic idealism uses aesthetic experiences in the process of picture making in order to reveal the nature of the object or model previously obscured by public dogma. And what that means is basically like Kehinde Wiley, right? He uses the aesthetic experiences of those books, those history art books, in the process of his picture making, so that those aesthetic experiences reveal a nature that we would never see because our minds are obscured by public dogma, right? By, you want to say, ideologies, you want to say mass media, mass culture. There's several stand-ins for that idea, but we perceive things, differently when we just go about unexamined. When we start examining those things, that's really when, this is where he's inviting us into this world of that second nature. And so the artist then is a catalyst for the second nature, right? That's what we're trying to spur on. We're trying to spur that, dig below the surface and reveal that nature that's maybe obscured by, the culture, the current culture around that young man, so that we can see his soul. That's really what it's about. And so just to bring it into a bigger context, what I am seeing, this idea of aesthetic idealism, which is, the project that I'm talking about, I'm leading towards this, there's the idea of philosophy in art. And philosophizing was defined by Leo Strauss as the ascension out of the cave into the light of truth. It's literally that analogy of the cave is how he defines philosophy. And I always thought that was just such a great way of thinking about, a student thinking about what philosophy is. And it's very real. It's very easy to understand because it's one of those images you can't get out of your head. That's what philosophy is. It's this movement, right, from the things that are common, the shadows, to the world of the big ideas, the soul, And so aesthetic idealism documents philosophy. Aesthetic idealism starts with documenting the movements of the soul of that young man as he's dealing with his present, as he's dealing with the opinions he has that led him down towards, towards jail, towards, sort of a tyrannical, violent life. And he brings it. We're trying to understand those opinions and challenging them, such that we can bring him into a new light of understanding who he is. And that's really what it's all about. So, here's art and here's philosophy. In a way, we're bringing, the poetics under, philosophy. We're bringing art under philosophy now. So that the social impact of all of this is really, obviously this kid is going to be learning this education. It's going to be odd and interesting, and it's going to be a trial all throughout the year to challenge his character. So he's getting that, and he's also getting this education fund so that he can move towards that goal of becoming educated, becoming something beyond what he was in the beginning of this. But I think that I see the social impact of this project. But really what I see is that the role of the artist has changed, and that the artist is no longer the solitary visionary, that kind of lives outside the community, that needs to have distance, that sees everyone as other, as Sartre said. Sartre said, hell is other people, right? I think there's a sort of tinge to that, even when you look at, Seinfeld. There's a lot of that existential philosophy in our art, postmodern art. And so that idea of the solitary visionary outside of the community, I think, has changed such that now the artist and community are in a dialogue, such that the artist has to have the community. He has to have that model. He has to have the input of that model. He has to understand the world from the eyes of the model. Because from there, from the level of the street, those movements of the soul that go towards those bigger ideas, those bigger abstractions, the artist now is documenting that and understanding everything in the context of that. He can't just start at abstraction. We can't just start at big ideas, abstract expressionism. We have to make our way there through the education of souls. And that's really what this is sort of all about, is using education as a way for the power of art to help art. And so that's really, when I think about that big question, maybe in the long run, I was thinking about this morning, when we think about the good life, maybe this is a better life for the artist. Maybe this is the good life for the artist as part of this project, and understanding his role within the community. And so I'm going to finish up here, and I'm going to talk very briefly about our budget, some brass tacks here. The biggest thing, I just want to highlight three things, and we'll move on. The biggest thing is paying this child. I always believe in that. Even when I was playing with the kids and they come out to their baseball game,